My brothers and sisters, my heart is heavy tonight, heavier than in any battle I have fought, heavier than in any storm I have endured as a soldier, heavier even than the weight of carrying the destiny of my people. Last night, when the news reached me, it felt as though my chest collapsed. I sat in silence, unable to breathe, whispering to myself, not him, not Judge Frank Caprio. The passing of this great man broke me. It brought tears I could not hold back, tears that still fall as I speak to you. I, Ibrahim Traoré, a man hardened by war, a man who has stood against empires and their machines of domination, was reduced to a grieving child. Because I did not lose only a judge, I lost a fatherly figure for all humanity. Judge Frank Caprio was more than a judge. He was a mirror held up to the soul of humanity. Yes, he stood in a courtroom, but what he gave was not justice in the cold language of law. What he gave was mercy, compassion, understanding. He showed us that true justice is not born from ink on paper, but from a heart that understands human struggle, from a conscience that refuses to ignore the suffering of the weak. When I first heard of his work, I asked myself, is such a man truly a judge in America, in a system known for its harshness? And yet there he was, day after day, proving that justice could be kind, that it could have a smile, a hand that comforts, a heart that heals. What pains me most is how rare men like him are. They are treasures in deserts of injustice. In a world where the scales of justice are so often tipped by wealth, race influence, or the invisible strings of power, Judge Caprio stood like an Oasis. He was no illusion. He was real, flesh and blood, who chose to live differently, to judge differently, to restore faith in humanity. He did not see the color of your skin. He did not see rich or poor, privileged or marginalized. He saw people. He saw your story, your struggle, your truth. In his courtroom, there was no hierarchy of worth. Whether you were the child of kings or the child of immigrants, whether your ancestors came in chains or free, your dignity was equal in his eyes. That, my brothers and sisters, is the essence of justice, the courage to treat people as human beings, not as labels, not as stereotypes, not as statistics. Too often in this world, justice bends toward the wealthy while the poor are crushed. We in Africa know this pain too well, but Judge Caprio refused to bow to such corruption. In his courtroom, the poor mother struggling to feed her children was not shamed or humiliated. She was treated with respect and compassion. She was given a chance. And the wealthy businessman, no matter how entitled he felt, received no special privilege. In that small courtroom, there was balance, something the wider world so often fails to achieve. He did not care for your status, your class, your religion. A man in torn clothes was heard as attentively as a man in a fine suit. A woman covering her head in prayer, a man carrying his Bible, or one declaring no faith at all. Each stood before him with equal dignity. Brothers and sisters, do you see how revolutionary that is in a world built on division? In societies quick to judge by accent, by passport, by skin color, Judge Caprio looked deeper. He saw the person. To him, a black man and a white man stood as equals. These were not just words. This was his way of life. And that is why he was loved. Because equality, when it exists only in law books, is meaningless. But when equality breathes in the daily decisions of those who hold power, it transforms lives. Judge Caprio gave life to equality, not through grand speeches, but through small, steady acts. And those acts, one after another, built into something monumental, a legacy of hope. To him, a struggling immigrant mother and a wealthy businessman both deserve to be heard with the same respect. Think carefully, my brothers and sisters. Respect is the foundation of justice. You cannot deliver justice if you cannot listen. And you cannot listen if you do not respect. In his courtroom, respect was never bought with money or inherited through lineage. It was given freely, because all were human. That trembling mother who walked in fearing the law left with her dignity intact, sometimes even with tears of relief. Why? Because she was not reduced to a number in a file. She was seen as a mother, as a woman of worth, as a human being whose struggles mattered. And yes, even the wealthy businessman received respect, not because of his wealth, but because Judge Caprio understood that respect must be universal. If it is real, it cannot be selective. That was his strength, his consistency, his refusal to discriminate in any direction, his belief that the law should serve all, not some. To him, the tears of a child who saw a parent treated unfairly weighed heavier than the cold figures written on tickets. My brothers and sisters, this is the heart of Judge Caprio's greatness. In most courtrooms, the fine is all that matters. The number on the paper, the punishment imposed. But in his courtroom, humanity mattered more. He understood that those tears could shape how that child would grow to view justice, authority, and humanity itself. And so he chose mercy. He chose to heal instead of harm, to encourage instead of crush, to teach instead of condemn. The tears of a child were sacred to him. He showed us that justice blind to humanity is no justice at all. It is cruelty dressed in legal robes. He proved that a judge could be a servant of humanity, not a master of power. That is what made him unforgettable. Too often judges see themselves as distant and untouchable to be feared. But Judge Caprio listened. He smiled. He comforted. He used his authority not to elevate himself, but to uplift others. And by doing so, he redefined what it means to be a judge. He showed the world that compassion is not weakness, that mercy is not the enemy of justice, but its completion. That when the law is tempered with humanity, justice is not diminished, it is perfected. And in this, he left a legacy far greater than any ruling or legal precedent. He left us a vision of what justice should be and what humanity can become. So when I say men like him are rare, I do not mean rare in number alone. I mean rare in courage, rare in humility, rare in love. Because it takes courage to resist a system that demands harshness. It takes humility to look at the poor and not see yourself as superior. It takes love to give respect to those whom the world disrespects. That is why he was a treasure in deserts of injustice, a light in places darkened by cruelty, a voice of humanity in halls too often filled with indifference. And that is why we mourn him so deeply. Because when such treasures are lost, the world itself feels poorer, and yet his example remains, shining for those who choose to see. His courtroom may now be silent, but his spirit still speaks. It speaks to judges in distant lands, reminding them that they too can choose compassion. It speaks to leaders across nations, teaching them that true power is found in service. It speaks to ordinary people like you and me, urging us to treat one another with the dignity every human being deserves. This is why Judge Frank Caprio will never truly die, because his compassion has been sown into the hearts of millions. And seeds of compassion, once planted, cannot be uprooted. They grow, they spread, they bear fruit for generations to come. Last night, when the news reached me, I could not sleep. My body was tired, but my spirit was restless. I closed my eyes and all I saw was his face. I tried to silence my thoughts, but they only grew louder. In the darkness, I heard his voice. The calm, warm voice that brought comfort to so many who once stood trembling before him. And I realized a man who never judged with coldness, a man who chose kindness over cruelty, had left us. I replayed his moments in my mind like a film that would not end. I saw him seated in that familiar chair, not with arrogance, not with harshness, but with the gentleness of a father. I remembered how he leaned forward, how his eyes softened when someone stood before him, afraid of what was to come. I remembered the countless times he let people go, not because the law demanded it, but because humanity demanded it. That was his greatness. He understood that the law without compassion becomes a weapon, but the law with compassion becomes a healing balm. I remember the single mothers who walked into his courtroom carrying the weight of the world, struggling to pay rent, struggling to feed their children. Their hands shook, their voices cracked, their eyes overflowed with worry. They feared that one more fine, one more punishment would break them completely. And yet, there he was, smiling gently, not mocking them, not dismissing them, but smiling with the kindness of someone who truly understood. He listened, not with impatience, but with full attention. He heard the exhaustion behind their sighs, the desperation in their tears, the unspoken words hidden in their silence. And instead of crushing them with punishment, he lifted their burden. He told them, in his own way, "You are seen, you are heard, You are valued. Think, my brothers and sisters, about what that meant. For those mothers, justice was not just a canceled fine. It was dignity restored. It was the reassurance that society had not abandoned them. It was proof that their struggle was not invisible. For a mother fighting each day to feed her children, such compassion is more precious than gold. Judge Caprio gave that compassion freely, and in doing so, gave them strength to carry on another day. I also remember the young men, so often black men, who came before him with fines they could never afford. They walked in expecting the worst, carrying the history of a system that had always been harsh with them, carrying the weight of stereotypes that painted them as guilty before they even spoke. And yet, before Judge Caprio, they were not judged as statistics or stereotypes. They were seen as human beings. They carried the scars of a world that punishes the poor for being poor, that punishes the marginalized simply for surviving. And yet, in Judge Caprio's courtroom, something different happened. Instead of adding more chains, he gave them hope. He did not see criminals. He saw young men with potential, with futures still unwritten, with lives that needed a chance, not another burden. With his words, his gestures, his decisions, he told them, I believe in you. And my brothers and sisters, when the world tells you every day that you are worthless, destined to fail, to hear one voice say, I believe in you, can change the course of your life. He reminded them that a mistake does not define a man, that poverty is not a crime, that youth is not a permanent sentence of failure. He gave them the chance to rise again, and sometimes that chance was all they needed. How many of those young men walked out of his courtroom with their heads a little higher, their hearts a little lighter, their futures a little brighter? How many chose a better path because one man, in one courtroom, decided not to crush them but to lift them? We may never know the numbers. We may never know how many lives he pulled back from despair, how many souls he rescued from drowning in shame. But in my heart I know they are countless. Because when a man like Judge Caprio sits on the bench, his influence does not end at the walls of the courtroom. It follows people into their homes, their neighborhoods, their children's lives. It shapes how they see the world and how the world sees them. Think of the child who sat in the back of that courtroom, watching a parent stand trembling before the judge, expecting humiliation, expecting punishment. Think of that child watching as Judge Caprio smiled, spoke with kindness, and gave relief. That child did not just see a judge. They saw justice with a human face, and that memory will never leave them. That child will grow up knowing that not all authority is cruel. Not all judges are merciless. Not all systems are broken. That child will carry within them the seed of hope planted in that moment. And perhaps one day, they too will show compassion, because once they saw it given to their family. This is the ripple effect of mercy. It spreads farther than we can measure. This is why Judge Caprio's legacy is so powerful. He was not simply ruling on cases. He was shaping lives, shaping generations. He was teaching us that kindness in power is not weakness. It is the highest strength. Now imagine the alternative. Imagine if those mothers had been fined, if those young men had been condemned, if those children had seen cruelty instead of compassion. Imagine the bitterness that would have grown, the despair that would have spread, the anger that would have taken root. That is what happens in most courtrooms, and that is why the world is so heavy with pain. But Judge Caprio chose differently. He chose humanity. He broke the cycle again and again. And so, when I think of his passing, I weep, because the world has lost a rare man. He was a man who proved that justice does not need to be blind to human suffering, that mercy does not weaken the law but strengthens it, that kindness does not undermine authority but dignifies it. Last night I could not sleep. I lay awake knowing that with his passing, a voice of compassion had been silenced, and yet I also knew that the echoes of that voice will remain forever in the hearts of those he touched. And so I wept, not only for myself, but for humanity, because when men like him depart this world, they leave behind a void that cannot easily be filled. In a time when too many judges sit cold and distant, quick to condemn without a second thought, He was warm, approachable human. In a time when justice often bows before power, he stood upright, unshaken, rooted in fairness. In a world where cruelty so often triumphs over compassion, he chose compassion every time. My brothers and sisters, tonight I do not stand before you as a president, nor as a soldier, nor as a revolutionary. Tonight I stand simply as a grieving man, mourning another man who inspired me deeply. When I speak of Africa's liberation, when I speak of justice for my people, I know that justice without compassion is no justice at all. Judge Caprio, though oceans away, showed us what compassion looks like in action. There is something in his story that must be told. He was the son of immigrants. He knew the struggles of working people, the quiet dignity of labor, the pain of those who go unseen. He never forgot where he came from. That is why, when men and women stood before him, he did not see strangers. He saw reflections of his own journey. He saw his father, his mother, his neighbors, his childhood. That is why his judgments carried warmth. They were not rooted only in law, but in empathy and shared humanity. And that is why he was so beloved. I ask you tonight, how many judges are mourned by ordinary people as if they lost a family member? How many judges become legends not for punishing the guilty, but for uplifting the struggling? How many judges can fill a courtroom not with fear, but with love? Frank Caprio was one such man. He did not build monuments of stone. He built monuments in human hearts, and those monuments will never crumble. When I heard of his passing, I thought of the poor mother in Providence who once told him she could not pay her fine because she had to feed her children. He looked at her and said, "Your priority is your children. You are a good mother." Do you know how powerful those words are in a world that so often crushes the poor? Those words were like light in the darkness. She walked out of that courtroom, not just free of a fine, but free of despair, lifted with dignity. That was his gift. That was his greatness. I thought of the young black man who stood before him, ashamed, bracing for punishment. Judge Caprio did not see a criminal. He saw a young man who deserved another chance. And in giving him that chance, he said, "I believe in you." My brothers and sisters, to believe in someone abandoned by society is one of the greatest acts of love. Judge Caprio believed in people. He believed in humanity. And he reminded us all that justice without humanity is nothing more than cruelty in disguise. That is why today, as I pay tribute, I say this clearly: Judge Frank Caprio was not just an American judge. He was a judge for humanity. He was a symbol of what justice should look like, whether in America, Africa, Asia, or anywhere in the world. He broke the chains of cold law and replaced them with bridges of mercy. He showed us that compassion is the highest form of justice. And tonight, as news of his passing spreads, people everywhere grieve. They grieve not in one language, not in one country, not in one culture, but in whispers, in prayers, in silence, and in tears. They grieve in church halls and mosques, in crowded cities and quiet villages, in places where his name was well known, and in places where only a single story of him was heard. That is the power of a man whose life touched humanity itself. His death has crossed every border, every division. Black and white, rich and poor, immigrant and native born. People everywhere feel this loss. That cannot be said of many men. Too often when leaders or judges pass, only their circle mourns. The powerful mourn their powerful friends. The rich mourn their wealthy companions. One community mourns its own. But Judge Caprio did not belong to one circle. He belonged to everyone. His kindness drew no lines, and so in death, neither does the grief. Think of it: the poor man who once trembled before him will shed a tear tonight. The wealthy man who saw in him not favoritism, but fairness will feel sorrow tonight. The immigrant mother who once feared the law, but found mercy instead, will remember him tonight. The child who once watched their parent receive dignity instead of humiliation will pray for him tonight. The student who saw his judgments online and felt inspired to study law with compassion will mourn him tonight. From Africa to America, from Asia to Europe, people who never entered his courtroom will say, "The world has lost a good man." And that is the proof of greatness. For greatness is not measured by wealth or titles or monuments. Greatness is measured by the number of hearts you touch, the number of lives you lift, the number of people who feel emptiness when you are gone. And tonight, emptiness is felt everywhere. That is greatness. For when you die and people of all races and nations mourn you, you have lived a life of true meaning. How rare that is. Many men live and die unnoticed outside their own circle. Many leaders live with fame but die with bitterness, remembered only by their failures. But Frank Caprio lived with compassion, and so he will be remembered with love. Judge Caprio is mourned across color, across creed, across borders, across oceans. When a black man in Africa, a white woman in Europe, a struggling immigrant in America, and a child in Asia all feel sorrow at your passing, then your life was not just personal, it was universal. It means you did not live only for yourself. You lived for humanity. Every day Judge Caprio walked into that courtroom, he was writing a legacy. Not the kind that gathers dust in law books, but the kind engraved in human hearts. A legacy of kindness, fairness, and justice with a human face. He could have chosen to be like so many others, cold, distant, harsh. He could have chosen to see only the law and not the person. But he chose differently. He chose meaning over power, compassion over cruelty, humanity over indifference. Because of that choice, his life was rich, not with possessions, but with purpose. His death is painful. Painful because we feel robbed of more years of his wisdom, more years of his compassion, more years of his presence in a world that so desperately needs men like him. Painful because in an age drowning in injustice, the loss of a voice of mercy feels unbearable. Painful because while we are grateful for the years we had, we always hoped for more. And yet, the weight of this grief is also proof of love. We do not grieve those who meant nothing to us. We grieve deeply because he meant so much, but his legacy is eternal. This is where the pain begins to heal. A man like Judge Caprio does not truly leave us. His body may rest, but his example walks on. His judgments live on in recordings that continue to inspire millions. His compassion lives on in the lives of those he lifted when they were falling. His kindness lives on in the children who witnessed it and will grow to repeat it. His fairness lives on in the young judges, the young lawyers, the young leaders who watched him and learned that justice without humanity is nothing. That is what it means to leave an eternal legacy. 50 years from now, a young law student will still watch his judgments and say, "This is the kind of judge I want to be." A parent will still share his words with their child and say, "Look, this is what true compassion looks like." A leader will still be reminded that power exists for service, not domination. And every time that happens, Judge Caprio lives again. So tonight as we mourn, we must also rise. Rise with gratitude for the example he gave us. Rise with determination to continue his work. Rise with the understanding that his death is not an end, but a passing of the torch. The torch he carried so faithfully is now in our hands. And if each of us in our own way shows compassion where there is cruelty, mercy where there is harshness, and dignity where there is humiliation, then his legacy will not only endure, it will grow. This is why Judge Frank Caprio's story will never fade, because it is not just his story, it is ours. It belongs to all who believe in justice touched by humanity. It belongs to all who believe a judge can be a servant of compassion. It belongs to all who believe that greatness is not measured by how much you rule, but by how much you love. Yes, many tonight are grieving, across every walk of life, from every corner of the earth. But even in grief, there is hope. Because if one man in one small courtroom could inspire the world, then surely the world itself can be changed, if only we choose to follow his example. Judge Caprio's life was meaningful. His death is painful. But his eternal legacy reminds us that humanity at its best is still possible. And his passing demands something of us, that we continue his mission, that we carry his torch of compassion, that in our homes, our communities, and our nations, we remember that justice is not about punishing, but about uplifting, that every leader, every judge, every politician, every soldier, remember their first duty is to humanity. If Judge Caprio could do it in a small courtroom, then what excuse do we have with the power of nations in our hands? Brothers and sisters, forgive me if my voice trembles tonight. Forgive me if my words come with tears. But I am not ashamed to weep for this man. Because true strength is not in hiding emotions. True strength is in honoring those who deserve our love. And Frank Caprio deserves our love, our respect, our gratitude. To his family, to his loved ones, to all who knew him personally, I send my deepest condolences. You are not alone in this grief. The world weeps with you. Africa weeps with you. I weep with you. For though he is gone from our eyes, he is not gone from our hearts. He lives in the laughter of every child he spared from hardship, in the relief of every mother he comforted, in the hope of every young man he believed in. He lives in us. So tonight, I ask you to pause and reflect on the life of this great man. Pause and remember that humanity is fragile, life is short, and what gives life meaning is not wealth, not titles, not power, but the love we show, the justice we uphold, the compassion we spread. Judge Frank Caprio showed us that. He showed us the way. Rest in peace, Judge Caprio. The world is darker without you, but the light you lit will never be extinguished. Your compassion lives on. Your justice lives on. And your legacy will continue to guide us. Ibrahim Traoré, bow my head in your honor tonight. May your soul rest in eternal peace.